Hello, welcome along to the home ground. We're looking at housing, Senate estimates, and a few questions being asked in Canberra about the industry and where reform is going. Max Schiffman, I know there was a recent question about recycling developers' properties and ticking the box from that respect. Is that robbing Peter to pay Paul when they're not really coming up with new dwellings? They're just putting upward pressure on first home buyers and another layer of complexities to the issue.
Yeah, thanks, Bash. I mean, like all these things, there's a political element and then there's a actual productive element. And so one of the things we saw with the Housing Future Fund in the early phase was it started spot purchasing established properties or almost complete properties that hadn't sold to the market. So, yeah, you could argue that was robbing Peter to pay Paul because that wasn't creating a new dwelling. It was simply taking a market dwelling and putting it into a social or an affordable marketplace. But look, that was definitely a short-term thing to try and get some runs on the board. The Housing Future Fund, as it's progressed, has increasingly been backing new projects to actually get out of the ground. I mean, we do have a demand problem with apartment buildings around the country because the general market doesn't want them. But the Housing Future Fund has come in and actually seeded the funding for some of these new projects to get out of the ground. So it is actually generating some new supply that would have otherwise either languished or not come out of the ground at all. And now I'm seeing developers actually planning some product into new projects, where if they think that some of it might be acquired for the Housing Future Fund by a housing association, it sort of becomes a pre-sale they can effectively bank on. And so they design a specific product into a larger project to take up some of that demand with the affordable housing.
Yeah, so it's a $10 billion fund all told, the housing fund. So what you're saying is that it stimulates developers to want to build more social housing as a result of that policy?
Well, I think it's a means to an end for some developers.
Right.
I mean, I know developers that have sat on sites with approvals, but the market won't accept the sort of price that you'd have to charge, for a new dwelling because of the cost of development. So what the housing fund has done is effectively agreed to buy or to fund, call it above market costly housing. That's really the way I'd put it in many ways. It's made projects otherwise wouldn't have gotten out of the ground, get out of the ground, but it's doing it at a cost base that's probably higher than what the market would accept at the moment. So yeah, it's technically creating new supply. I question whether it's value for money for the taxpayer.
And what about new dwellings, though? What about unlocking land? Does it solve that type of problem whereby you're spreading the load a little bit? You're concentrating too much. The way I look at it, and I might be wrong, but you're not increasing your base. You're not getting the supply issues out there.
Yeah, it's not dealing with the core issues that are preventing the bulk of new housing to come out. So a lot of discussion is around, the fact that they're unlocking up to 55,000 homes, they say, through various means across the Housing Future Fund and the Housing Accord. But 55,000 homes out of a 1.2 million home target is a drop in the bucket. It's, 4.5%. So all this focus, all this energy has been put into what they're doing in the Housing Future Fund, and it's not really anything to unlock the other 95, 96% of housing. And as we see, the approvals data and commencements data shows we're a long way off delivering what we need, and none of the stuff that the Housing Future Fund has done has changed that, really. In fact, you could argue that it's unlocked a few projects, so the actual number of commencements is higher than what it would otherwise have been. Those numbers would have been terrible without the Future Fund, but they're not great with it.
Is it the structure of the Australian Housing Future Fund that is the issue, or is it almost it's become a political means to an ends?
Look, it's all politics, and for me, the Future Fund is a good idea. We needed to invest more in publicly supported housing, but really, it's about creating the impression that there's a lot of stuff being done. So it's called Housing Australia as the body running it because they want to say, look, we're doing something around housing. That is very much a political decision. Once the Future Fund has exhausted its $10 billion, you're going to have to keep replenishing it every few years, which, may be on the cards, but it delivers, one set of housing for a period of time. It's not solving the structural issues that we have in this country around delivering new housing.
Well, how can it be more independent and more proactive, more of a commission-based structure where it's outcome-based in a sense?
Well, it depends what the outcome is. I think the Housing Future Fund's being judged on how many houses it gets built. It's not asking questions, in my view, around is it the best value for money? Is it doing the most unlocking of supply across the board? Because that's not its remit. It's really there to deliver social and affordable housing with some level of federal subsidy or funding to make it a reality. And you could argue that that's all its remit is, and it shouldn't be responsible for other things. But it doesn't solve the core issues that remain in as barriers to delivering new homes around the country.
Okay, another interesting issue, ageing population of Australia, wanting to downsize, wanting to get into small and medium dwellings, but stay in their community, mostly for the regional areas. And it could, if that was solved better, that could somewhat unlock a lot of potential for first home buyers and the housing crisis. Do you see that as an issue, and how can that be alleviated if it is an issue from your point of view?
Yeah, look, certainly housing mobility is a major issue, and there's a misallocation between the housing people currently own and perhaps what might be better suited to their stage of life. But you certainly can't force people to move out of a larger home just to accommodate a family. You know, they own the home. It's got sentimental value, plus you might only need one bedroom for most days, but you might also want to have people visit, or younger family members come and stay over. So it's not automatic that a large house is actually too large for someone. But I think it is very much, like all these things, an economic issue. You see, when you're moving house, there's a cost. You've got to pay an agency and some marketing to sell it. And then you've got to buy on the other side, and you're going to be paying stamp duty and other moving costs and things. So it's not a cheap process to undertake to move from a larger property into one that might be more quote unquote suitable. And the other problem you have is the cost of delivering new dwellings now, particularly in regional areas, is quite high. And so the cost of delivering a small dwelling can be as much or even more than what the established house price is. And the rational economic decision for most older home buyers is, unless they can take some equity out of their home and put it into super or their retirement, they're not really actually likely to be spending more money on a new dwelling than the value of their old one. So if you can't create a differential, the economics dictate, well, I might as well stay where they are, and that's what most people will do. So it does become very hard to find those opportunities, particularly in those regional and growing areas, to move to something that might be more size appropriate because of the economics and the logistics.
You touched on the cost involved with buying new property and selling existing property, and how prohibitive that can be to the fluidity of the market. So I know we've said this before, Max, but when is reform part of the conversation? When is structural reform part of the conversation, where you're cutting the red tape to make it easier for first home buyers to get into the market and for established owners to move in the market?
Well, the first home buyer side, they have some incentives already. They often don't pay stamp duty or pay a reduced rate. So you've kind of solved that part of it. But stamp duty remains one of the biggest barriers to housing mobility. And many economists, the RBA, have talked about it. It is a huge issue because it creates such a massive disincentive to moving. I mean, Victoria right now has the highest stamp duty rates in the country. Obviously, they only shade in at a higher level, but for most people, you're paying somewhere around 5% of the value of the dwelling you're buying in a single line check that goes to the state government. And it's the same around the country. Queensland, New South Wales, they've all got stamp duty, right? So every time you move, and you might want to move for all sorts of reasons, you might have a job that you want to move closer to, or you might want to move to, I don't know, you have a kid's school that you really want to be close to and want to give your kids the best education. So every time you want to try and buy the house, as if the house isn't expensive enough, you then got to just pay a check to the government. So people aren't going to move as often as they might. Maybe renters will, but then you go into the whole issue around rental supply, which is also very low. So you have all these things in the way of making it easy to move geographically to either the house that you want or the place that you want. And stamp duty is absolutely it. Now, the problem is governments are so wedded to stamp duty as being a source of income. In Victoria, 50% of our state taxes now come from land tax and stamp duty, and the bulk of that is stamp duty. And so for a state government to give up one of its sort of most lucrative tax incomes is a really big issue, especially when every state government now, except for WA, has massive debt. spending a lot of money, and they're looking for ways to increase tax rather than decrease
But
it.
there comes a point where that becomes a barrier to entry into the market for new investment, doesn't it? And
It's a massive barrier,
so
but they don't care. They don't listen to advice. I mean, you can see that. I mean, you're not in the industry, but you can see how big an issue that is. But I find that from a political perspective, they don't want to spend less to do all this sort of stuff that would actually grow the economy and allow more investment. They're just keen to hold on to the tax base they have and tax it more. And so you look at stamp duty, the rates for stamp duty, or the thresholds, I should say, for stamp duty haven't changed since 2000, and I think it's 7 in Victoria. So we're, 18, nearly 19 years on. And the median house was less than half what it is now. And it's an incremental thing. So the higher up you go, the greater the rate you pay. So the average house, when the stamp duty was last changed, was paying about $10,000 to $12,000 in stamp duty. Now it's 50 plus. So governments are just addicted to this tax take, and they can't see beyond that to unlock the investment that we would need as a successful state.
well, I see it as a seesaw. On one side, you've got the consumer, and on the other, all this weighty tax. And very soon, the consumer is going to be flipped off and out of the contest altogether. So I just don't understand where the tipping point is.
Yeah, it doesn't end well, but that's kind of where it's going at the
Right.
moment. It's caused some real challenges around housing generally. It's been exacerbated again. I'm picking on my lovely home state of Victoria a lot. They've done some things that have disincentivized investment for a long time around surcharges for investors and rental rules for tenancies and other bits and pieces, and obviously increasing land tax to a much lower threshold. So that's been a real disincentive. But weirdly, it's kind of flipping at the moment, where investors are coming back in because now Victoria's become relatively cheap. So the point is, you do all this stuff, and there are all these unintended consequences of making these changes. But the ultimate consequence is you disincentivize investment of any kind, whether it's, I don't mean as in investors buying property. I mean developers aren't building it, people aren't buying it, and so the whole economy starts to become stagnant. And we're seeing that here, and we're seeing it in other parts of the country too.
Okay, and just a final one on immigration. The much vexed question of Australian immigration and how that puts upward pressure on housing prices, but also it does achieve a skills shortage in the construction industry. So how do you balance the two competing forces and get the policy right?
Yeah, well, interesting nuance there. It hasn't actually helped us solve the construction
It hasn't?
housing crisis, so the construction crisis, because for the most part, the migrants that we've seen really pick up post-COVID to make up some of the lost ground in migration haven't been construction workers. And the reasons for that are complex but explicable, and it's not a conspiracy where they've said don't bring in construction workers. It's actually an artifact of the visa system. You see, the way the construction economy works, it's mostly made up by subcontracting companies or subcontractors, and so they're all effectively small business people that run, a couple of apprentices and, don't have a lot of employees, because employment comes with a lot of other red tape and bureaucracy that people don't want to deal with. And there are actually a lot of incentives from a tax and structuring perspective to work as a small business in the construction industry. But the problem with that is you don't have companies that actually take on employees at a wage level that allows them to sponsor migrants to come here and work for them. So the reason we haven't had a lot of construction workers is not because the government said we don't want construction workers, even though some people think that. It's simply that the way our construction economy works means you don't have the companies that can sponsor people with those skills. And so we've seen this very large spike in migration, and it's remaining elevated even though it's come off the peak. But it's meant that only a tiny fraction of people that have come here have the construction skills. Now, there are estimates that we're over 200,000 construction workers short in this country. That's across all things. That's for infrastructure, but also for housing and apartments and everything you can
So
imagine.
even if the land was unlocked, we couldn't build it? Is that
We
what you're
would
saying?
struggle to massively increase construction, because we're competing with this huge infrastructure spend, be it tunnels in Victoria or in New South Wales, or be it the Olympics in Queensland. So that's absorbing a lot of the excess capacity. We're not seeing tradies come out of local schools at a rate that we need. In fact, there's been a lot of work done to try and make going to TAFE for an apprenticeship a lot cheaper and have incentives around doing it. But what you find at times like that is people take up the incentive and they don't actually finish the course. You're seeing relatively low translation of people entering into the TAFE system and apprenticeships into completion. So we're just failing to get people into the tradie workforce as quickly as we need, and we've just got this huge crush. So even if we had higher approvals, and we don't, but even if we did, we would struggle to massively increase the amount of housing we're building.
And was that a catalyst to so many builders going under, especially in Victoria? Was that part of the reason?
It's certainly part of it, yeah. I mean, we've talked about that before, where it's just this perfect storm of locking in low contracts or price at low contracts and then construction costs escalating. But one of the big factors in escalation was the lack of labour. So labour costs massively spiked really, really quickly, because tradies, even if they'd committed to a job, would ring up a builder and say, hey, I've just been offered double the money down the road. If you want to keep me, offer me double plus 10%. And it just became a race to the top.
Yes.
And that sent companies broke. Now, you're not seeing that dynamic at the moment. Things have subdued a little bit, but it set a new floor for the price of construction labour. And that's very much influenced by state governments throwing obscene amounts of money at infrastructure projects just to secure their workforce, and it's done it at the expense of the private sector workforce.
Okay, this leads me to the final question. So, if within your developer, portfolio and peer group around Victoria, if there was three things that small to medium developers could have happen in the market to get you more incentivised to part solving the housing crisis, what would it be?
Well, look, one of the big issues we face generally is that there is a feasibility gap, right? So you almost need to have commercial incentives to build certain types of housing, even just for the mid-market, because the mid-market is where things are lacking. The top end is working, the HAF is supporting the social and affordable end, but you're missing the 90-odd% in the middle. That's the scary thing. So that part of the sector needs some sort of incentive or subsidy. Now, I don't necessarily love things like grants to people to get things moving, but you need to unlock, whether it's key infrastructure or whether it's localised planning issues beyond the planning permit itself, and possibly throw some money into the housing, because the cost of housing, the building of it, has gone up so much, and a lot of that is because of recent red tape change, etc., etc. They've done some things to slow down the NCC changes, so we're not going to see another spike in housing as regulations change until 2029 now, but we're still dealing with the impacts of the last changes, which came in the last couple of years, and they increased housing by 20-30 grand. So if government wants to keep increasing the cost of the housing, we also want to see more of it, they might have to come to the party and subsidise a portion of it. I don't know how else you bridge that feasibility gap at the moment.
Well, there's so many issues, but we've discussed a few. Good on you, Max. Hope to discuss a few more down the track.
I hope to get you back and investing in Victoria again, which is what a lot of people want to do.
Well, I want to, but I'm finding a lot of barriers out there.
Yeah, there certainly are.
Okay, we'll see you soon on the home ground.